At the start of the animation, Marshmallow has very smooth and clean shape. Then when it starts to burn, the bubbles start popping out everywhere. After a while, all sorts of drops and snot starts to appear. So let's try to stylize it somehow using standard Cinema 4D tools. It is not very possible to deform this particular topology so much that you can get bubbles and snots. That's why we're gonna use Volume Builder and Volume Measure. Make sure that the body is selected, then hold down Alt and create Volume Builder. This tool simply fills the internal volume of the mesh with voxels. The voxel is simply a pixel but in 3D. You can adjust the voxel size. The lower the value, the higher the resolution. We need to pick the right value so that the details are well read, but not so low that it eats up a lot of computer resources. Now, while the Volume Builder is selected, hold down Alt and create Volume Measure. The Volume Measure will just create a polygonal mesh based on a voxel-filled surface. The main advantage of the Volume Builder is that you can drop a lot of different objects inside, and it will merge all the objects into a single mesh. Look how it repeats all the polygons of this sphere. If you select Volume Builder, you can adjust some details. For example, we can increase this radius, and it will smooth the borders between the objects. Also, you can create SDF Smooth. It'll just smooth the whole surface. I think it's a perfect solution for making those bubbles. Now we can create a bunch of spheres and sketch out some good composition. I don't want to have too many objects in Volume Builder and adjust every single object by hand. And the good news is that you can use nulls inside the Volume Builder. So let's create a null, parent to Volume Builder, and put sphere inside. I'll remove SDF Smooth for now, and now we have two objects, body and null. Now if I select the sphere and duplicate it, it will appear inside the null, and the Volume Builder will work with all the objects inside this null. If your computer is not very powerful, you can turn off the Volume Builder and Volume Measure. For now, we need to think only about a good composition. We have a static camera in this scene, so we need to make it look good from the camera perspective. And it is unnecessary to model something that we cannot see from the camera. It will take some time, so I'm not gonna show you how I arrange all the spheres. I'll just show you the final result. After several minutes, I have this result. It is just a bunch of spheres parented to null, which I renamed to bubbles. Note that I did not do this from behind, because we'll never see it from the camera perspective. Now let's see how it looks like with Volume Builder. In Object List you can find Bubbles null, and I'm gonna slightly adjust the radius to get a bit more drop shape like this. Let's disable the Volume Builder and think about how we're gonna animate this. We need to make something that allows us to move all the spheres out of the body. In the first frame, they will be inside the body and move out like this. Also, I want to animate the scale of the spheres to inflate them at some point. The best solution is Plane Effector. Let's create it and place inside the Bubbles null. Now go to Deformer tab and switch to Object. This allows it to affect all objects that are inside the null. Plane Effector can move objects along arbitrary axes. You can try X, Y, or Z, but we need them to be moved towards or away from the body. Let me show what we're gonna do. I'll disable the Plane Effector for now. If you select this tiny sphere and rotate it so that the Y-axis looks towards the body, then turn on the Plane Effector, and in Parameter tab, switch the Transform Space to Object. It's still gonna move it along Y-axis, but it will use the local coordinates of each object. That's why we need to rotate all the spheres in the way that Y-axis looks towards the body. You can do it manually, but there is a way to make it much faster. Let me show you. Just select all the spheres, then go to Tags and create Constraint tag. Make sure that all tags are selected. Then scroll down here and switch constraint type to aim. We can use plane effector as a target. Just click here and select plane effector. We want to point the y-axis towards the center of the body, so select Y+. Now if you select the plane effector and adjust the Y position, you can see that the spheres move towards or away from the plane effector. So we can place the plane effector to the center of the body, maybe slightly higher. Now we can animate the strength of the plane effector to push the spheres out of the body. I also want to animate the scale of the spheres, so select plane effector, go to parameter tab, enable scale, and then also enable uniform and absolute, and set scale value to -1. Now if you change the strength, spheres will not only move but also decrease in size. We can animate this parameter, but for me it looks so boring. To make it much more interesting, we can use fields. Go to Fields tab and create linear field. If you move it along the x-axis, you can achieve this kind of effect. Let's see how it looks in Volume Builder. Looks pretty nice already, but for me they appear too evenly and I want to add more random. Let me demonstrate what we're gonna do on a simple example. Here I have very similar setup. It just moves cubes along the y-axis. For instance, let's create another field, and this time we're gonna use shader field. As a shader, I will use noise. I temporarily turn off the linear field. This is pretty obvious. Shader field just moves all cubes based on noise shader. So now let's try to blend it with linear field. I'll select plane effector and switch the blending mode to overlay. Then shader field will only affect the gray area between 1 and 0. Now we only need to adjust the parameters of the shader. I'll go to noise shader. I'll click this icon to undock the parameters to make it more convenient. I want to adjust the low and high clip parameters. It will add a bit more contrast. Now let's do the same with marshmallow. Select plane effector and create shader field. As a shader, we're gonna use noise. Now select plane effector and change the blending mode to overlay. Last time we talked about that shader field works with UV coordinates, but this time we don't have any UVs. That's why go to noise shader and switch space to world. Now everything is correct, so let's check how it works. Looks nice already, but I want to adjust some parameters. In particular, I want to make the noise a bit more contrast, adjust its scale, and maybe play with seed parameter. And maybe make the linear field a bit shorter. I want to rename the plane effector to activate bubbles, and in my case it looks something like this. On animation stage, we're gonna animate the X position of the linear field. Now let me demonstrate how do we go about making those hanging snots. While experimenting with the volume builder, I noticed that if you create a sphere and a cylinder and place it like this inside volume builder, it already looks quite similar to what we need. To enhance this effect, we can use something like SDF Smooth. It has a few settings. You can experiment with this to achieve the result you want. And as you see, it looks like a slime drop. I want to make a setup that will allow us to move the sphere down like this and adjust the cylinder automatically. I want it to get thinner as it lengthens. And also, it would be awesome to make it bend. Now I'll remove what I made, and it will be much more convenient to create this setup in new project. At first, let's create a sphere and right away make it approximately the same size as in the test. In my case, it's about 13. Hold down Ctrl or Command and Mac to duplicate and rename one to Start and the other to End. In the test, I used cylinder, but the spline is much more flexible. So let's create an empty spline, then switch to points mode, then hold down Ctrl command on Mac and click 3 times like this. Now we got spline with 3 points. I'll immediately switch type to cubic and intermediate points to uniform. I want to control the position of the points using objects. In particular, I want to control this point with this sphere and the other point respectively. And this middle point will be controlled by some kind of controller that will allow us to bend this spline. So now let's create a null and rename it to snot. Select all objects and place it inside the null, then select the null and create Expresso tag. To control the points of the spline, we're gonna use point node. Just type point in a search bar, then drag it and drop into editor. It is not very complicated, it has 2 inputs, the object we want to modify, the index of a point we want to move. And let's add third input, which is position in which we want to place the point. We want to modify the spline object, so drag and drop it into Expresso. Hit the red square and find object. We will use it as an object input of the point node. Now drag and drop the object we will use to control the point. We're gonna use its position, so hit the red square and find global position. And the index of the point we want to control we will set manually. In our case we have 3 points and indexing starts from 0, so we can choose between 0, 1 and 2. First let's choose index 0. And then try to connect everything, object to object and position respectively. Now let's recap. The point node takes the point with index 0 and places it into position of the start object. That's why we need 3 point nodes, 1 for each point. You can duplicate them by holding down Ctrl command on Mac. We'll use the same spline object, so let's connect it. We still have no controller for the midpoint, but for now drag and drop the end object. I also forgot to change the indices, so this is 1 and the last will be 2. Create the global position output on the node called end. Then connect it to the last point, the one with index 2. Now let's check how it works. The midpoint still not controlled by any object, it's controlled by this point node. So let's create a null and rename it to middle. Then set the shape to cube to make it visible in viewport. Then drag and drop it into Expresso and move it inside snot. Add global position output and then connect it to the point position of the point node. Now we can control midpoint, we're gonna use it to bend our snot. Let's give the spline some thickness. Just select spline, hold down Alt and create sweep. This is the same approach we used for the lips, just create a circle and adjust its radius. Now I'll select all the objects and reset all local coordinates. Let's take a look how everything works. I want to animate the end and the middle to change the shape of the snot. If you have glitches like this, just select Sweep Object, go to Attributes, then scroll down here and uncheck everything except banking. You can also disable caps. Okay, let's see what we got. We can control end and the middle, and basically we can use this for animation. But we will have a lot of snots that we will have to animate manually. That's why I want to automate as much as possible. For instance, I can make this middle part to be animated automatically. For this, let's select it and create constraint tag. Then go to Attributes and enable Transform. Go to Transform tab and as a target, select Start Object. Next hit Add and the next target will be End. Notice that now we cannot change its position because it's controlled by 2 objects, the end and the start, and it's always in the middle between them. You may notice that when I move the end, the middle is a bit lags behind. This is because the Expresso takes the position of the null before the constraint tag changes it. To fix this, we need to change the execution priority. Select the Espresso tag, and here you can see priority, and I'll set it to 5. The main idea is to set it higher than the priority of the constraint tag. This way, the Espresso tag will set positions of the points after constraint tag set position of the middle. Okay, now we have the middle always in the middle, and it's still not very helpful. But what if we select constraint tag and go to transform tab and turn off the X and Z position? So we'll keep only Y position. This way it will be moved only vertically, and we got this bendy motion for free. And now all we need to animate is just end object. If you want, you can adjust its position between end and start. To do so, go to constraint tag and play with these two sliders. You can move it closer to end or closer to start. So during animation, all I have to do is just take this end object and move it along some circular path like this. I want to organize it a bit, so select the end object, hold down Alt and create a null and call it end. Select some shape. I want to use sphere and make it a bit bigger than the sphere. It will help us later with the volume builder. Now let's do the same for the start object. Create a null and call it start. Select some shape and then scale it up a bit. Now let's correct some parameters of the sweep object. I want to make the radius of the circle the same as the radius of the spheres. In my case, it is 13. And also, I want to adjust the shape of the sweep. Scroll down to Details tab, and here you can find Scale. I'll just create one point in the middle and move it down a bit. I just want to make it a bit narrower in the middle. Next, we're going to make this sweep thinner as it stretches. In other words, when it becomes longer, the radius will decrease. For this, we're going to use Espresso. Double-click on Espresso tag, and the thickness of this knot is basically the radius of the circle. So let's drag the circle and drop into Espresso. We're going to control the radius, so drop it as an input. The thickness will depend on the distance between these two knots. So we can immediately drag and drop the start null and the end null. We're going to use its positions, but this time we're not going to use global positions. Instead, go to Coordinates tab and use position from here. Make sure you drag letter P, not X, Y, or Z. We use local positions because I want to be able to scale this knot. Note that when I scale it, the global position between two nulls changes. Since the radius depends on the distance, it will also change, but I want to keep it the same while scaling. Measuring distance between two positions is pretty straightforward. Just find distance node. Then drag it inside Espresso and connect positions to inputs. If you connect the distance to the radius will be the same as distance between these two nulls. So let's check. And this is too big, of course. We need to make it so that when the distance between them is 0, the radius is 13. And when the distance is large, the radius is 0. For that, we're going to use the node called RangeMapper. Tap it in the search bar and drop here. Let's pass the distance through RangeMapper. It doesn't change anything yet. Let's look at the parameters. If the input is 0, the output will be 0. And if the input is 1, the output will be also 1. At first, we need to figure out how far do we need to move the end so that the radius becomes 0. For instance, I want to use this particular distance, so I want to know its value. For this, we can use Result node. Just connect the distance to the input, and you can see it here. When I move the end null, you can see that the value changes. So let's use something about 200. So when the distance is 200, the radius should be 0. Now let's set up the RangeMapper. So the minimum distance is 0 and the maximum is 200. And when the distance is 0, we want to set our radius to 13. And when it's 200, the radius is 0. Now let's check. When I move it closer, the radius is 13. And when it's 200 centimeters away, the radius becomes 0. Just in case, go to Node tab and enable clump lower and upper to avoid some negative values. For now, we have linear dependency between distance and radius. But I want to keep the radius 13 a bit longer and then make it drop quickly at the end. To remap the values, we can use this spline section. Just hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac and click to create points. And then you can adjust the shape of the curve. For instance, if I shape the graph like this, at the start the value will not change much, but closer to the end it will drop. Let's see how it looks. At the start the radius is almost the same, and then it quickly drops to 0. I want to adjust the shape a bit more. And maybe correct the max distance a bit. I'm just imitating the animation and seeing how radius changes. Looks pretty good, so let's create some temporary animation. In the first frame, I'll just zero out all the local coordinates. Now let's set animation slider to something like 25 and set a keyframe. Then go to frame 35, move the end down along y-axis and then set a keyframe. Then in frame 30, move it aside a bit like this and set a keyframe. Let's play the animation. I know this is really boring animation, and ideally we need to add some frames after to make some secondary motion. But as always, I want to automate everything I can. That's why make sure that the end is selected and create track modifier tag. In Tag tab, set strength to something around 50 and set the mode to string. Let's play the animation, and you can see that this tag automatically adds the secondary motion. Let's adjust some parameters. There are not so many. If you increase stiffness, it will become more rigid. The drag is something like air resistance. The strength is obvious, and I will pick the values that I like visually. I noticed a little issue. You can see that the middle is a bit laggy. It should be always in the middle between start and end. But when the end in the secondary motion, the middle stays in place. This kind of issues is always about priority. We need to execute the constraint tag after the track modifier tag. Let's check the priority of the track modifier tag. It is 0, so let's set the priority of constraint tag a little bigger. I'll set it to 1, and it still should be less than expressor priority. Let's play the animation. And looks like everything is correct. You know what? I just realized that we will never use this null. So in Object tab, let's set the shape to none, and it will be much more convenient to make the snot null visible. It allows us to select the entire snot in viewport. We're almost done with the snot setup. I just want to organize everything and do some cleanup. I want to remove animation. For that, hold on Shift and hit F3. Just select all animation tracks you have and delete. Next, I want to add some user data. We will have a lot of snots and other objects, and I don't want to search all these tags every time I want to change some parameter. For instance, I want to be able to adjust this input upper parameter, which is the maximum distance, because we will duplicate, move and scale different snots, and they probably will have different maximum distance when the radius becomes 0. If you want, it will be convenient to move this spline to user data It will add more control without opening the Espresso editor. And the last thing, I want to be able to disable the track modifier, because sometimes it's very hard to animate when it's enabled. So select the SNOT null, go to user data and add user data. The first parameter will control the max distance, so I'll leave float, the unit is real, the min is 0 and the max, let's try 300. And let's call it max distance. I also set default value to 200. Let's add another data, this time set type to boolean. This is just a checkbox, we're gonna use it to disable the track modifier. And let's call it simulation. And the last data type I'll set to spline. It has no any parameters, so let's just call it something like remap. Hit OK. We got user data tab. We're going to use max distance parameter to control the input upper in range mapper. So let's drag and drop this SNOT null and then create the max distance output. Actually, let's drop everything. Simulation and remap. Now we need to add inputs to range mapper. We're going to control input upper, so hit the blue box and create input upper. And then connect it to max distance. Also, I want to control this spline shape, so let's add spline input and connect it to remap. And simulation will control track modifier tag. So let's drag and drop it into Espresso editor, add checkbox we want to control and connect it to simulation. Let's check how it works. Track modifier is enabled. If we disable simulation, track modifier is also disabled. Let's also adjust max distance. I'll just check how it moves and adjust it based on the movement. When we connected the remap, it was reset, so let's create the spline again and adjust the shape a bit. The setup is done. Select all objects and zero out all local coordinates. I'll move ant down a bit along y-axis, then turn off the simulation so that it doesn't interfere during the animation. Now we can copy it and paste into our original project. You can move it around and maybe adjust some parameters. After that, let's create a null, parent it to volume builder and rename to snots. Then place our snot inside. If you enable the volume builder, you can still see the nulls. You can make it invisible if you want to see the shape better, or you can make it visible to select and manipulate it in viewport. Next, we're gonna prepare the project for animation. In Attributes, go to Mode, Project, and set FPS to 12. I'll disable Volume Builder to save the computer resources. I also want to adjust viewports a bit. In Panels menu, I want to switch it to side-by-side views, and I'll switch the right view to front. This way we can animate it here and see it in the left from the camera. Then create a plane and place it like this. We're gonna use it for reference animation. Expand Material Manager and create standard material. Then drag and drop it into plane. In Material Attributes in Color tab, select Texture. Hit Load Image and select the file with reference animation. The proportions of the plane are wrong, and proportions of the video is 16:9, so we can set 160/90, and then just scale it up a little. You can place it as you want, maybe like this. If you scroll the timeline slider, you can see that the animation is not playing. To fix this, go to Material Attributes, and in Viewport tab, enable animation preview. Let's see how many frames do we have. Animation ends at the 50th frame, so I'll leave 55. If you want to change the amount of frames, go to Mode, Project, and you can set it here. We no longer need the Materials Manager, and if you want to switch display shading modes, for instance wireframe, but you want the plane to still display the animation, select Plane and create Display Tag. In Attributes, enable Use and select Display Shading Mode. I'll use Constant Shading. Now you can switch between display shading modes, but you will still see the animation. Let's start with the mouth. Before that, we created a pose morph tag, and basically we can use these sliders to change the shape of the mouth in different frames. But this time I want to use different approach. In different cases, we can use different approaches to animate the mouth. For instance, we can create very complex system with a lot of controllers, which will allow us to have very precise control over every little expression. But it takes a lot of time to create such system, and it's very hard to control a lot of animation tracks. The other approach is to use pose morph tag. You've probably heard another term called blend shapes. This approach is very useful for lip sync, because in this case we need to animate a lot of repeating shapes. We can have a shape for every vowel and consonant and blend those shapes using blend shapes. If you want, you can use pose morph tag to do this. Just switch to edit mode, then add new pose. Then you can use modeling or sculpting tools to shape as you want. Then in pose morph tag you can rename this pose. Then switch to animate and you can animate these sliders. Then hit Shift plus F3 to reveal the dope sheet. To set a keyframe, set the animation slider to the frame you want, then hit this little diamond icon near the parameter you want to animate. The parameter that you animated should appear in this list. It will contain all animated parameters. Now I can change the value of the parameter and set another keyframe in different frame. The value will be interpolated between two keyframes. Switch to curve mode if you want to see the interpolation curve. In this mode you can adjust interpolation curves. For instance, if I shape it like this, it starts to change very slowly and then go rapidly. Or in this case it will start very fast and then slowly goes to 100%. But in our case I want to use different approach. Notice that we literally have about 10 or 12 mouth animation frames. And it is not very convenient to create a lot of different poses in pose morph tag, for each of which we will have a separate animation track. That's why I'm gonna remove the pose morph tag and use point level animation. Let's switch back to dope sheet. To enable point level animation, this button should be gray and all others should be blue. By default, it looks like this. So we just need to enable point level animation and disable everything else. Now when I create a keyframe in frame 0, you can see new animation track called PLA. It contains positions of all points of the object. If you set time slider to different frame, adjust the position of the points, and then create a new keyframe, it will store new positions and will interpolate between two keyframes. This way we can create new poses very quickly without creating new sliders in pose morph tag. But there is a drawback: we can't control the interpolation curves. In PLA it is always linear. But in this case it's not so bad. We'll animate in 12 frames per second and we will fix the shape of the mouth in every frame manually. You can quickly scroll the slider, change the shape, create a keyframe. You can also move or duplicate keyframes while holding Ctrl or Command on Mac, and some little mistakes and irregularity will add a little hand-drawn or puppet animation vibe. So now let's try to animate it in our project. At first I'll remove the pose morph tag. I'm gonna animate in front view so that the spline always stays flat. This is necessary for the bend modifier to work correctly. At first, let's adjust the shape for the first frame. Overall, it looks pretty much the way it should. Now let's enable the point level animation. These buttons should look like this. Now let's create a keyframe and then move it into 0. Next, let's find another important keyframe. It's something around frame 28. Then switch to point mode. Then use modeling or sculpting tools to mimic the shape from the reference. When it's done, set a keyframe at frame 28. And we got linear interpolation between two keyframes. Next, I'm gonna find the last frame where the mouth is closed and then duplicate the 0 frame and move it here. The next keyframe will be where the mouth is open. In my case, it is 24, so let's sculpt this shape. I'll temporarily disable teeth. And when you're done with this pose, don't forget to create a keyframe. Right before the frame 24, it looks very similar to the first frame, so I'll duplicate it here and I'm gonna make a little anticipation before it opens. I'll just slightly push it up and maybe narrow it down a bit. I always look at the left view to see it from the camera. Don't forget to set a keyframe. I don't like this linear motion much, but if you like some frame in between, you can hold down Ctrl command on Mac and click. I got a new keyframe which I moved to 20. This way you can blend different shapes. I also want to adjust the frame 24 a bit. The next key pose will be in frame 25. I'll just reuse the frame 28 and adjust it a little using sculpting tools. I also want to make a little overshoot before frame 28. For this, I'll duplicate it and slightly push the corners of the mouth down. Let's see how it looks. I have such a draft animation, looks nice in general. I just want to tweak some poses and then we'll move on to the next keyframe. Here I'll speed up the video. I'll just refine some shapes to make it smooth and to achieve smooth transitions between frames. Sometimes I shift some frames in time to achieve a nice rhythm. The next key pose is when he starts to scream. It's about 38. The same here, just make a pose and set a keyframe. Let's see in which frame there is still a pose from the frame 28. It is about 35, so let's duplicate it here. And also duplicate it into 36 to make a little anticipation before he starts to scream. Update the keyframe. And I'm gonna tweak all poses a bit. After some tweaks, I got this animation. Let's analyze it a bit. In frame 19, I have neutral pose. In next frame, we got some anticipation, the mouth tightens, and the tension builds up to the frame 23. And when we get to the frame 24, it instantly opens. After that, the corners of the mouth go down, then it bounces up a little, and we got to the keyframe in frame 28. Then it keeps this pose up to frame 34. A little anticipation in frame 36, and in 38 he starts to scream. I also want to add some shaky motion to the lower lip when it screams. I'll just select the bottom points and shake it like this. Just move it up a bit, then set a keyframe. Now we have two keyframes, and we can just select them and duplicate a few times. I like the way it looks in general, so I'll leave it like this for now. Now let's enable teeth and see what happens to them. It looks good almost everywhere. The first thing that I want to do is to scale them down a bit. If you remember, we need to select not nulls but geometry. I'll switch to object mode, then activate scale tool, and to scale them individually enable this checkbox. On reference, on the lower jaw we have 3 teeth. So let's duplicate one of them, and I'm gonna call it tooth low mid. Then go to Align to Spline tag and adjust its position. Next I'm gonna fix all positions and orientations of all teeth. Just remember to rotate geometry, not nulls. And to move it along spline, use Align to Spline tags. Notice that I adjusted for the frame 28. That's why let's select all Align to Spline tags and animate the position in this frame. Now let's see how it looks in other frames. In 25 it looks awesome. That's why we can set a keyframe here, and we need to fix the frame 24. Let's set a keyframe at frame 25, then go to frame 24, and looks like we need to fix not only position but also orientation. Let's fix positions at first. Don't forget to set a keyframe after you made some changes. Now we're gonna fix the orientations. Let's select the geometry and figure out the axis of rotation we want to fix. But before we fix it, we need to set keyframes on those frames where we already happy with the orientation. We're gonna rotate along this blue axis, which is B. So before, let's go to frame 25 and set a keyframe here. And then do the same for all the teeth we want to fix. After that, I can go to frame 24, rotate it the way I want, and set a keyframe. I'll check other frames, and in my case, everything looks good. Now we're gonna animate the tongue. It starts to appear approximately in 37-38 frame. Now let's make it visible, and at first I'll select the null and adjust its position and orientation. In my case, it already looks quite good. After that, I'll tweak the bend modifier to give it organic shape. I'll temporarily disable displacer, and we're gonna animate roll along y-axis to make it roll out. First, let's create a keyframe for the final pose when it's unrolled. I'll do it in the frame 40. Now select roll and set a keyframe for coordinate y. It will start to roll out in frame 38, so adjust the y coordinate and set a keyframe. I also want to animate bend strength to add a little secondary motion. I'll slightly unbend it in frame 40 to make a little overshoot. In the frame 38 it will be curved inward. And in 42nd frame it will get the final pose. I'll make bend and roll invisible and enable displacer. Select a shader field which is responsible for the waves and will animate spline offset. I'll speed up the video and I'll just set 2 keyframes and pick such values so that I like the animation. Then I'm gonna make it invisible before it starts to roll out. It will happen probably in frame 37 or 36. Just select the tongue null and we're gonna animate these 2 parameters. In 37th frame, I'll set it to default, and in frame 36, I'll set it to off. And the last thing, I want displacer not to deform the object during the rolling out. For this, I'm gonna animate its strength. In frame 42, I'll set it to 100%, and in 38th, I'll set it to 0. I'll use Dope Sheet to tweak some frames. We can use shortcut Shift plus F3. In this list you can see all animated parameters, but if you click this icon, it will show only those you selected in Object Manager. I'll select the spline and I want to reduce the movement of the lower jaw so that it doesn't intersect the tongue so much. I think tongue appears too early. You can see some intersection with the lips. So I'll select the tongue null and move visibility keyframes 1 step forward. Before we start animating eyes, I want to move the parent null in the middle between 2 eyes. For this, hit Enable Axis, select the eyes null and move it right here. We need this to be able to scale both eyes simultaneously in object mode. I'm not going to rely heavily on the reference. I will try to match it with the mouth animation. Disable point level animation and enable everything else. We're gonna animate scale, make sure you use object mode. At first, I'll set a keyframe right before the mouth starts to change. In my case, this frame is 19. While the tension of the lips grows, I want the eyes to get smaller and smaller before they blow up. So I'll set the time slider to frame 23 and scale it down a bit. Then set a keyframe. Then in 24th, they will blow up. Scale it up and set a keyframe. Also duplicate the frame 24 to the point where the corners of the mouth goes down. In my case, this is the frame 28. And in this frame, I'm gonna make it a bit smaller. Maybe not so much. Let's animate the eyes rotation. Don't forget, we need to animate connect objects, not nulls. Let me just check the frames where they start to scale. At first, I'll set the keyframes of neutral poses in frame 19. I want them diverge a bit while shrinking. So let's set the time slider to frame 23, then rotate the eyes and set keyframes. I think it adds more tension before they blow up. The next key pose is in 28th. I'll just mimic the pose from the reference. Next, we can adjust the shape of the pupils using user data we created. At first, I'll select both eye nulls and set keyframes for all parameters in frame 19. In 23rd frame, I will slightly decrease the size of the pupils. And in 24th, they will grow up, and I also add the waves effect. Let's find FFD deformers and make it visible. And this time we're going to use point level animation, so let's enable it. Then switch to point mode, and I'm gonna use the magnet tool. Notice it works with several selected objects. At first, as always, I will set a keyframe in frame 19. You should get PLA animation tracks. Let's immediately duplicate these keyframes into 23rd, 24th and 28th also. In the frame 28, I'm gonna deform the shape so that they look a bit melted like in the reference. Let me remind you that when I sculpt, I'll look at the left view to see it from the camera. And don't forget to record the keyframe. Now I want to make a smoother transition between these two frames. That's why I'll duplicate the frame 19 into 22 and adjust the frame 23. I just want to make a feel that they start to fill with the air right before they blow up. Let's see how it looks. I think they blows up too slow, so I'll select all animated objects and then move frame 28 to 27. And I'll tweak the shape a little more in every frame. Everything looks nice already, so I'll leave it like this. And let's move on to another pose. The left eye is going to be puffed up like a balloon, and the right will be blown away and flattened. At first, I'm going to find the last frame where the stays the same. It is a frame 36, then I'll select both FFDs and duplicate last keyframes into frame 36. And the final shape I'm gonna make in frame 40. I'll set a keyframe and then reshape the other FFD. I think it's too slow, so I'll adjust the timing. Next, I'm gonna animate the rotation of the eyes. I'll duplicate the last keyframes as always. And in 39th frame, I'll rotate it as in reference. And the last thing, I'm gonna animate the shape of the pupils. As always, I'll set keyframes in frame 36 and then change their shape in frame 39. I also want to fix the orientation of this eye in frame 39 to make the pupil more visible. And for the right pupil, I want to animate the rotation parameter when he starts to scream. I want to fix a lot of stuff, but it takes a lot of time, so I hope you get the general idea and make it better. The last thing I will probably fix is teeth visibility. I want to make them invisible before the mouth opens. For that, I'll just select the teeth null and then animate these two visibility parameters. I will do the same with the middle tooth. I want to make it invisible when the tongue appears. When the face is done, let's animate bubbles. For that, I'll enable Activate Bubbles, and we're gonna animate this linear field. I will just animate the position along x-axis. This is pretty straightforward. I'll just create two keyframes, and it will move from left to right. Now the animation is not very expressive, and I want to add some secondary motion. To do that, we can use Delay Effector. Just place it inside Bubbles Null, and in Deformer tab, set Object. In Effector tab, switch mode to Spring. It affects all objects in Parent Null. Now we can see some secondary fluctuations. Now I'll hit play and will correct different parameters. For instance, I'm gonna adjust keyframes of the linear field. You can also adjust the noise in shader field to make it more random. And maybe play with the length of the linear field to make this effect shorter or longer. Before we start animating snots, let's analyze the animation. At first, only one snot appears, and after a while we can see others. It will be easier to animate one, then duplicate it and tweak some parameters. Let's figure out when it should appear. I think it's when all the bubbles appeared. Now let's adjust its position to make it look good from the camera. Just to make nice composition. We will animate this null called AND. So at first let's set a keyframe in a final position. Then go back a few frames, move it up and set a keyframe. I'll just reset the local coordinates in this frame. And then somewhere in the middle, move it aside a bit. This way we got this kind of arc motion. Now let's see how it looks with simulation enabled. I'm gonna use user data we created. I don't like how simulation looks for now, so I have to tweak the parameters of the track modifier. As you see, it is good that we didn't make a lot of copies of this node. We will fix and animate one and then we'll start to duplicate it. Looks not bad in general, but I want to make this motion more expressive, so I'll move it a bit further in the middle frame, and then add a bit more keyframes in the middle to make this arc rounder. I also think it appears a bit late, so I'll select all the frames and move it a few steps back. Let's see how it looks with Volume Builder. It will slow computer down a bit, but I think we can see the general idea. Now we can see the snot before the bubbles, but we'll fix it later. I want to disable the simulation before the snot starts to fall out. In my case, it starts to fall out in frame 28, so let's select the snot null and animate the simulation parameter. And I will disable it one frame before. If you want to see the animation in real time in Volume Builder, we can temporarily cache the animation. Let's make the snot null invisible to hide the nulls from the viewport. Now if I play the animation, it is very slow. Let's try to cache it. Select Volume Builder, go to Object tab and create Cache Layer. Then enable animation, set it from 0 to 55 and then hit Cache. And now we can see the animation. And you know what? I just noticed that the bubbles appears too late. I want to shift the entire animation of bubbles and snot 2 or 3 frames back in time. This is also pretty straightforward. I'll just select all animated objects, select keyframes, and move it 3 frames back in time. And when the animation of the snot is ready, you can start to duplicate it. I'm gonna duplicate them in a final frame to be able to see the final composition. Other snots should appear when he starts to scream. That's why when you made the first copy, select this snot, then select all animated objects, and then shift all keyframes in time to the moment where he starts to scream. In my case, it is too late, so I'll move it back a bit. And then I'll add some uniqueness, maybe rotate it a little. You can shift frames in time and also scale it a bit. If you're gonna scale it, make sure you use object mode. This way you will change the local coordinates of the object. For some snots, I will also change the animation. In this case, I just want to settle it down a bit and simplify. The snots on the sides are the most important and they should be very expressive because they affect the silhouette. That's why I'll make them first and spend more time. The same here, I'll rotate it differently and then offset the animation to make it appear in different moment. And I will do the same with all other snots. I'm not going to show you how I did everything because it takes a lot of time and the work is pretty repetitive. I'll just show you the final result. As a result, I got this animation. I separated the first snot from the others and called it snot first, and the others are inside the null called snots. I did this because they appear in different moments of time and I want to animate their visibility. The problem is that we can see them before the bubbles and we cannot animate visibility because it doesn't work with Volume Builder. Let me demonstrate. If I go to the last frame, then turn off the visibility and enable the Volume Builder, it still generates a mesh based on it. And the best way to fix it is to use instances. At first, let's create a null and call it Original Snots. Then parent to body null and place all snots inside. Then select snot first and create instance. Then do the same for other snots. Select the null and create instance. Then place both instances inside Volume Builder. And you can make original snots invisible. And now we can enable and disable instances and it will affect the Volume Builder. I also want to move it below the body in Volume Builder object list so that the radius of the bubbles affects it. And now we can animate disabling of the snots. The first snot appears in frame 27, so I'll animate this parameter and disable it in frame 26. Then do the same with the others. This time they will appear approximately in frame 29, just a few frames after the bubbles. I'll throw in a couple more ideas how to add more details to the animation. For example, when he starts to scream, we can make the bubbles to flow down a little. For this, I'm gonna use another plane effector. Now they moves along local coordinates, but I wanna move them down. To fix it, set transform space to effector. Now they moves in effector space. I'll just move them down a little along y-axis. I want to make them a bit more random, that's why I'll use shader field and use noise as a shader. And then adjust it as we did earlier. And I will animate the strength parameter. You can add some shaking to the stick. For that, let's create a null, rename it to pivot, and then place everything inside except camera and reference plane. Now it's on the center of marshmallow, but I want to move it to the left. Let's enable axis and move it like this along x-axis. I'm gonna animate this kind of motion. Let's figure out the axis. In my case it is B. I want to lift it up a bit when he starts to anticipate and then he drops down with little overshoot and secondary motion. Nothing complicated here, I'll just mimic some damped oscillations. Also, you can add vibration when he screams. Select Pivot Null and create Vibrate tag. In Attributes, enable Rotation and set some small amplitude. And you can see how it vibrates on all axes. You can also adjust the frequency. I probably decrease the amplitude. Now we can animate the amplitude so that the vibration starts from certain frame. Right before he starts to scream, I'll set the amplitude to 0, and after several frames, I'll set it to 1. Another idea, we can add the skin folds under the lips. For that, select the spline of the lips and then create an instance. Then place it inside Volume Builder. The Volume Builder also works with splines. Select Volume Builder, find the spline in Object List, and you can adjust the radius. It works very similar to Sweep Generator. We also need to add the bend modifier so that it follows the shape of the face, but for now I'll just move it down like this, and then create a new bend modifier, place it inside, and bend it a little harder so that it penetrates inside the face. You can also adjust its scale a bit, and if you want, instead of bend, you can use FFD. It is much more flexible, but the main idea is to use the instance of the spline so that it follows the shape of the lips. And since we use an instance, we can enable and disable it in different keyframes. Let me show you a few more ideas you can experiment with. For example, I want to make the snots a bit smoother, but I don't want to use SDF Smooth in Volume Builder. You can create a smooth modifier and place it inside Volume Measure. It should be placed right before the Volume Builder. As you can see, it makes the mesh smoother. But the good news is that you can use fields with this modifier. For example, I can create linear field, and this way I can smooth only top part or only bottom part. I'm gonna smooth the tips of the snots. I'll move it a little lower to avoid smoothing the bubbles. This way you can use any modifiers. For instance, you can create displacer, place it inside Volume Measure, give it some noise shader, and maybe add some kind of vibration while it screams. You can also experiment with fields, but this time I'm not gonna do this. Try to experiment with all this stuff. For example, try to create an FFD and try to deform the overall shape of the marshmallow. This way you can create some melting effect.